Welcome to MEERTALK. My name is Kathy Posey, your host for today's MEERTALK. We're really glad to be getting together for another MEERTALK. Today we will be hearing from Jeff Goodell. Then we'll take questions from people in the MEER community. After that, we'll open it up for some questions from all of you in our audience. In case you didn't see our recent newsletter, MEER's Dynamic India team showcased a model illustrating the practical applications and effectiveness of solar reflecting technology in environmental conservation at their college's annual Gaia Fest. In order to carry out all the projects crucial for MEER's further development, we do rely on donations. If you don't already donate and you'd like to contribute toward our efforts to cool the planet, we appreciate your donations. You can go to meer.org/donate, and we thank you so much for your contributions. You can also write to info@meer.org to be in touch. Now, let me tell you about our guest speaker. Jeff Goodell is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. He is the author of 6 previous books and has been writing about the climate crisis at Rolling Stone and other publications for more than a decade. If anyone has questions that come up while Jeff is presenting, please send them to co-host Vian Nguyen in the chat. Okay, Jeff, we are eager to hear what you have to say, so please take it away.
2024 was the hottest year on record. The last 10 years have been the hottest decade on record. It's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. We all know that. That's why you're here. I'm not going to go into detail about that, about why that's happening. I know that everyone is on this understands that this is being driven by burning of fossil fuels mostly. So I'm not going to elaborate on that. But I do want to talk about why this is important beyond the obvious. What's important beyond the obvious is that we all know that the Earth has been hotter over Earth's history. We know that there have been times when there have been alligators living in the Arctic. This is, and everyone who talks about, I live in Texas, one of the headquarters of climate denial and delay. And everyone always points out to me, well, Jeff, it's always been hot, or it's been hotter in the past and all that. And that is absolutely true. And there's been wild swings in temperature patterns on the Earth's climate over millions of years. That's not new. What's new is that this is happening we built our civilization within a very steady kind of temperature zone of the last 10,000 years. So we are very well adapted to this particular range of temperatures. And as that range of temperatures moves higher, the entire sort of ecosystem, both human and sort of natural, is built to deal with this fairly narrow range of temperatures. And that is basically the problem, is we're moving out of what I call in my book the Goldilocks zone. In other words, our human bodies and our infrastructure, our civilization is built for a climate that basically, for all intents and purposes, no longer exists. So that is the challenge. It's not that it's never been hotter on the planet before. The challenge is we are not adapted to, our world is not adapted to these higher temperatures that we're seeing. And as those temperatures continue to rise, this maladaptation is a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. This is what climate risk is all about. And I want to make this important point that I think a lot of people who understand climate really well still don't understand this basic idea that CO2 is not like smog. The idea is that we are not, it is not like, grew up in California. We had problems with air pollution there. The skies were yellow. We put on catalytic converters on cars, put scrubbers on power plants, and smog went away. That's not what CO2 is like. CO2, once it gets into the atmosphere, is for all intents and purposes permanent and is global. Whether it's emitted in China or whether it's emitted in Texas, it doesn't really matter. It stays up there for thousands of years. It does not just sort of dissipate and rain out like, say, acid rain did, if you're familiar with that from the 70s. Um, 80% of it comes from fossil fuels. You all know that. Uh, and another important, really important thing is that for everyone to grasp in thinking about this is that temperatures are going to continue rising until we get to net zero emissions, right? So that's a long way off. There's some people who would like to hope that we can get there by 2050 or something. The way things are going, not likely. But whenever we do reach that point, only then will the temperature rise that we see now stop. And it will not go back then. All that will do will stop the rise of the temperature. It will not bring us back to the old climate that we're used to. So what's the big idea here is that what is happening to our climate is not reversible on a sort of human time scale, and that we are building for all intents and purposes, a permanently different climate. We are not going back. I used to like to say that climate change is not like a broken leg where you just do the right things for 6 weeks. Everybody sells their SUVs, goes to work on skateboards, and everything is going to be fine and go back to the way it was. It's really important to grasp that that's not going to happen. We are permanently building a different climate system. And the reason this is a big problem, of course, is that as these temperatures rise and as we move out of this Goldilocks zone, I like to think of heat as this sort of engine of kind of planetary chaos. And you see it manifesting itself in all kinds of ways in our bodies, right? I live in Texas where it's hot all of the time. It was 80 degrees here yesterday. It's going to be a brutal summer again. I'm sure it was a brutal summer last year. We have a mechanism for dealing with heat, which is sweat. Works fine under certain conditions, but it can only deal with so much change in temperature. And as the climate gets hotter and hotter, we have a more and more difficult time in dealing with that. I go into that in great detail in the book if you're interested in how our human systems are adapted to heat and why that matters so much. A hotter climate also means bigger and more intense hurricanes. We're talking about Category 6 hurricanes now. We're seeing them not so much more frequent, but sort of spinning up more rapidly, faster, more intense, and importantly, kind of more rainfall, because one thing we know is that a hotter climate holds more water. This is a picture I took last week or 2 weeks ago in LA after the fires. A hotter world is also a more flammable world. Everyone, this is sort of basic sort of physics. Everyone kind of intuitively knows this who's ever tried to start a campfire. A fire starts much easier with dry wood than wet wood. And what's essentially happening as we get hotter, our atmosphere gets hotter and hotter, it sucks moisture up out of plants, out of the soil, drier conditions. When a fire does start, it burns faster, burns bigger. This is why we are one of the main drivers in seeing these bigger, more intense wildfires that we're seeing, that LA was such a heart-wrenching example of. Obviously, it is plants are like humans. They need certain conditions to grow in also. They have the same kind of Goldilocks threshold that every other living thing has. And so as our precipitation changes and as the world gets hotter, plants have a more and more difficult time to cope. This is particularly important for humans, for food crops. Rice, corn, wheat, all those kinds of things have thermal tolerances that we are pushing the boundaries of, which has big implications for our food supply system. I write a lot in the book about how changing temperatures, changing disease patterns. As it gets hotter, insects do what every other kind of living thing does, which is try to move to a cooler, more kind of comfortable climate for them. And for example, one of the species that is very good at moving is mosquitoes, as we all know. And those mosquitoes carry all kinds of pathogens that cause a number of diseases, from Zika to dengue fever. things like that. It also, as animals move around, increases the risks of pathogens jumping from one species to another, which is sort of what we're seeing with bird flu, and which, arguably, actually not arguably in my point of view, happened with the COVID uh, um, pandemic. We're seeing the risks of new pandemics rising as animals move around and these pathogens jump from one species to another. We're seeing lots of migration in the oceans. Um, the oceans are a big heat sink. They sink up about 90% of the heat on the Earth's planet in the climate system. As they warm up, fish, like everybody else, moves around, has huge implications for sustainability, for food supply, for a lot of island nations. Also, of course, barrier reefs are bleaching out. I write about diving on the Great Barrier Reef in my book and seeing this magnificent ecosystem being rapidly degraded by rising ocean temperatures and acidification. So, and then this is a photograph that was taken by a drone on a ship that I was on in West Antarctica, where I went on this 3-month science voyage to study Thwaites Glacier, one of the most unstable glaciers in West Antarctica, with huge implications for sea level rise. And what scientists on this trip found and have continued to find is that these enormous glaciers, this one's the size of the state of Florida, ice sheets the size of the state of Florida, are beginning to melt from below because of the warming water, or even a small changes in temperature have enormous implications. And we're seeing a similar thing in the Atlantic circulatory system, which controls heat transfer from the tropics up to the northern hemisphere. That ocean conveyor belt, as it's sometimes called, there's a lot of speculation right now about it slowing down and perhaps even stalling altogether, which would have huge implications for the climate, particularly in the northern hemisphere. And I just want to say a couple of words about adaptation, which is, of course, really important when we think about it in a hotter world. People say, "Oh, well, it's hotter, but we'll adapt. We're smart. We know how to deal with this kind of thing." And of course, it's not so simple, right? I mean, one of the ways that people are already adapting, just like fish, just like mosquitoes, just like every other living thing, is when it gets too hot, when it gets out of their Goldilocks zone, they move. And a lot of migration is driven by changes in climate, whether it is directly due to the sort of heat they're dealing with, or because of economic issues related to climate change, or food supply. So migration is a huge issue that's going to get bigger and bigger as these temperatures continue to rise, as we continue to burn fossil fuels. And I don't think I have to explain to anybody how migration brings a more chaotic world, changes our politics. Of course, we're seeing that right now. I mean, why did Trump get elected? Because fear of strangers coming in, particularly brown or black strangers. The idea that, so I think it's really fair to think about, rising heat, extreme heat, as a driver of this kind of politics, which it certainly is. There's this question about air conditioning, which I could talk about for 3 days. It's such an interesting and complex question, but that comes down to this idea that people love techno fixes. I live in Texas. People often say, "Yeah, it's hot, but I have an air conditioner." Well, great. I'm glad you do, but there are 750 million people on the planet who don't even have access to electricity, much less air conditioning. The idea that we're simply going to sort of air condition our way out of this is profoundly naive and profoundly misguided. Even if you thought that humans themselves could deal with it with air conditioning, you're not going to air condition, the Great Barrier Reef. You're not going to air condition the forests. You're not going to air condition the fields where food crops grow. It doesn't solve the problem. It is only a tool that allows us to, in some cases, deal with it better than others. But it is not a kind of silver bullet for this question of extreme heat and climate change. I love all these gizmos that are starting to arrive now to deal with extreme heat. I see them starting to see them on the streets here in Texas. People with walking around with individual little fans or ice vests. Even these umbrella shade caps. I mean, there's all these technological doodads that are sort of emerging as sort of tools to deal with extreme heat. And it's sort of um, amusing to me to see all this stuff suddenly in the last few years coming out. Needless to say, we're not going to use ice vests to save ourselves from a hotter world. But, one of the inspiring things about adaptation and changes that you're seeing is the push for um, greener cities, for more shade structures in cities, for more water resources in cities. Uh, I write a lot in my book about something called the urban heat island effect, that cities are often 5 to 10 degrees hotter than the surrounding area because they are built of asphalt and concrete and glass and steel, all of which absorb heat and then radiate it back. So there's a big effort in the world right now in some places, to think of ways to build cooler cities. This is a rendering of Paris, of City Hall. Paris is doing probably more than any other city in the world in thinking about this. Everything from, reimagining the Champs-Élysées and narrowing it to traffic and putting more trees up, to this kinds of things that you're seeing in front of the city hall here, to cleaning up the Seine so that it's swimmable for people, to thinking differently about rebuilding old low income kind of apartment buildings and making them much more energy efficient, and using natural ventilation and things like that. So there's a lot of things that are really interesting that are going on in certain places in the world, who are recognizing that, these cities will be uninhabitable, or at least dangerously inhabitable, if something isn't done to think differently about how they're built and how they're constructed. I live here in Austin. This is a picture I took of Barton Springs. If anyone's ever been to Austin, you certainly know what Barton Springs is. It's a public pool, basically a sort of blocked up river and spring, where people swim in. When you go there on a summer day in Austin, you can hear the bodies sizzle as they go into the water. But it's a really important kind of public, space that gives people a kind of place to go and to deal with the heat. And I hear many, many people talking about that, like how I couldn't live in Austin without Barton Springs, kind of thing. And again, I don't mean to say that this is a kind of fix for heat, but as our world gets hotter and hotter, as cities become more and more difficult to live in, these kinds of public cooling spaces are increasingly important in how we think about the future of cities. And this is one more picture from Austin. This is the Blanton Museum of Art. I know this is, people will say, well, this is just an art museum, who cares? But what I love about this is they just put these shade structures up. They're designed by a architecture firm called Snøhetta. They're really amazing. And what they are to me is they took this sort of concrete plaza that was a sort of no man's zone in Austin, and turned it into, by adding these shade structures, this sort of beautiful space that tons of people hang out at now. And it's become kind of iconic for Austin, one of the, postcard, Instagram places. And to me, it's an example of how you can think differently about urban space and about cities, and not only, deal with heat and shade, but make them more beautiful too. Um, it's not it's an opportunity for change that can, if you think about it the right way and with a kind of creativity and inspiration, can make cities more pleasant places, not less pleasant places. It's just a matter of how we turn our brains to think about it. And then the last thing I have to mention is solar geoengineering, which I know some of you here probably have thought some about. I wrote a book about this about all kinds of geoengineering about 12 years ago called How to Cool the Planet that sold about 4 copies. It was an idea that was slightly ahead of its time, I would say. Uh, but I think that, I mean, it's quite obvious that this is something that more and more people are taking seriously now. The idea is there's lots of different kinds of geoengineering, but the idea that is gaining the most traction now and is most likely to be deployed at some point in the future, for better or worse, is stratospheric aerosol injection, which would basically mean you have a fleet of high altitude aircraft flying around, injecting sulfate particles or some other particles, likely sulfate to start, into the atmosphere, which reflects away some of the sunlight, acts as sort of mini reflectors up there in the stratosphere, and can cool the temperature of the planet by, well, by as much as you want, depending on how much aerosol you put into the atmosphere. This is, again, a topic we could talk about for days and days. There's all kinds of problems with it. Whose hand is on the thermostat? Who decides how much we're going to lower the temperatures? You have to keep doing this because those particles rain out of the sky. So if you start it, you basically have to keep doing it. How is it going to shift? You can lower temperatures, but how does it shift other thermal dynamics, monsoon patterns, things like that? There's a lot to talk about here, but I do think, especially as things are going with Trump and sort of the general speed of temperature changes and awareness of this, I do think that, as another writer once called it years ago, a bad idea whose time has come. And I can't not think about it that way. I wish we didn't even have to talk about this, but we do. And this is the sort of ultimate techno cooling mechanism for our climate, and something that could be worth exploring and even worth doing if it were done right. But that's a big if. Okay, so that's all I have to say in this part of the remark. Now I want to hear what you want to say, what you want to talk about.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. So we're first going to bring on someone from our MEER community who would like to ask you some questions. And just a reminder that our audience can please send questions to Vian Nguyen, co-host in the chat. That's Vian. So first, I would like to introduce Mariana Hernandez, who is a geodesign undergraduate at the University of Southern California, with a focus on community engagement, sustainability, and humanitarian activism. She's passionate about geospatial data and research, and currently volunteers at MEER, collaborating with the communications team to promote MEER's vision of addressing climate change through innovative surface cooling technologies. Mariana.
Hi, good morning from my end of California. So I guess one of the most important, and I'm assuming very common question you get specifically about your book is what inspired you to write The Heat Will Kill You First? Is there a specific anecdote, experience, or reflection you had when you gained the inspiration to write this book?
Yes, there is actually many books, and this is my 7th book, and other books have arisen out of a stew of ideas and desperation and hope, and they just kind of emerge out of an ooze. This one did have a very particular moment when I had the idea to write it, which was in the summer of, I think it was 2019, maybe 2020. I don't remember which summer it was, but I happened to be in Phoenix on a reporting trip, nothing to do with this book or anything, on something entirely separate. I was late for a meeting. It was 114 degrees that day. I was staying downtown at a hotel. I had about 20 blocks to go to get to my meeting. And I called an Uber. The Uber was late. I decided, okay, the hell with it. I'll just run. I'll just get there on foot. And I went out into the street, and it was hot. Of course, the heat hit me like a wall of just this force field. But I thought, oh, I'll be fine. And I just like kind of walked about 6 blocks, and then I realized that my heart was pounding. I was getting dizzy, and this was like a dangerous and stupid thing to do. And it was like this, I realized, oh my God, this heat is not just uncomfortable, but dangerous, and that was a big insight for me because it was a big insight because I, at that time, had been writing about climate change for more than 15 years. I'd been all over the world. I thought about, global warming is kind of gives you the hint that heat might have something to do with it, right? But I had never thought about it in a personal way. I had never thought about it about, oh, this could kill me in the wrong situations. And that's basically not only the genesis of the book, because I thought if I don't understand this, then a lot of other people probably don't either. And it also is the genesis of the title of the book, which has been quite controversial, I think maybe in a good way. But when I first proposed this idea to my publisher, the idea of the title, they said, no, 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 no. No one's going to read that book. That's a very bad idea. That's too dark, too depressing. And I'm like, no, it's not dark and depressing. It's provocative and challenging. And the reason I wanted it to be that title, though, was because I think a lot of writing and thinking about climate change is not only too polite, but too distant. It's about future generations. It's do-gooders worrying about some, scientific hypothesis. It's about distant people in distant places. It's like it can, in the kind of dialogue, it can feel like, this sort of hunger in Africa thing, right? Of like, oh, we've been hearing about, we know there's people who are hungry, we're sorry, but, and the same thing I think can happen with climate change. It's like, yeah, we know, even among people who care about it, right? Not the deniers. But I wanted the book to really be to really say, this is about you. This is about your life. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if, like me, a sort of, climate writer who's been thinking about this as much as anybody, didn't understand this. Um, you know, a lot of other people don't get this, and that's why I also started my book with the story of a family who went for a hike in California, sort of healthy young family with their child that ended up dead from heat stroke. I just really wanted to communicate the everydayness of this, and take this question about what's happening to our climate and the risks that we all face out of sort of academics and wiggly line charts and into people's lives in a way that would capture their attention.
I completely agree with you that bringing specific current problems into a more personal and perspective is really a way to move audiences. With that being said, this goes into my next question. What was the most surprising or alarming fact you discovered during your research?
Um, the most surprising or alarming fact I learned during my research. Uh, well, I think, let's see, I think the most alarming thing I learned is a very big picture thing, which is how sensitive our world is to small changes in heat, right? Not only like, you know, the way that a change of 2 degrees or 1 degree Fahrenheit of temperature can, change malaria patterns in Africa. Tiny thing, tiny amounts of change of temperature can put, you know, millions of people's of lives at risk in ways that we don't even really think about. When I was in Antarctica looking at Thwaites Glacier, my previous book had been about sea level rise, so I've thought a lot about glacial melt and everything. But Antarctica was a huge eye opener to me because, Greenland is, you know, ice, it's obvious the hotter the Earth gets, the more ice is going to melt, right? It's like dropping a popsicle on a sidewalk on a summer day. It's like pretty basic physics, right? But I've been to Greenland too a number of times, and in Greenland you see the ice melting. You see it pooling on the top of the glaciers on the ice sheets. You see these big moulins, these sort of rivers that flow. I mean, it's very obvious what's happening in Greenland. It's just a question of scale and pace and everything to understand it. But you don't need to know anything very complicated to see that Greenland is melting. You just got to go walk out there, and there it is. Antarctica is totally different. There's no surface melting whatsoever. And for a long time, scientists thought basically that Antarctica was very stable. But they've now realized, and part of the research that the ship I was on was doing, was to see how ocean temperature changes affect these glaciers. And long story short, what's happening in Antarctica is a change of 1 degree Fahrenheit in the Southern Ocean temperature, which is tiny change, and practically unnoticeable, is allowing the slightly warmer water to get underneath these ice sheets and melting them from below and destabilizing them from below. And these ice sheets, the West Antarctic ice sheet has enough ice for 10 feet of sea level rise. And no one is saying that's going to happen like in the next 20 years, but the risk of instability in these ice sheets is enormous and growing. And it's growing because of a tiny, tiny change. It's just, so the idea that these small changes in temperature have these enormous implications was, I think, in a meta way, the biggest sort of insight that I had that I didn't really get before I started this book.
Thank you so much for letting us know. So moving on to our next question. This is more a personalized question I have. So I grew up in California, and we are known for being one of the states with the most growing crops and produce exporters. And one of the topics most interesting to me about the book was the sweat economy, where outdoor workers, like those in agriculture and construction, are amongst the most vulnerable to rising temperatures. What policies or protections do you think should be prioritized for them?
Well, yeah, so I grew up in California too. And I wrote about the death of an agricultural worker in Oregon in the book, and used that as a kind of narrative to tell the story of the risk of heat to outdoor workers who are by far the most vulnerable, well, among the most vulnerable to extreme heat. Yeah, it always makes me insane, because you have academics and people who have entirely indoor lives, thinking, not able to grasp why it's heat is such a big deal for workers. And it's because they don't work outside, right? And so, when you're an outdoor worker, your vulnerabilities are enormous, especially when you're doing physical work. And especially when you're doing outdoor work, physical work, agricultural work, where there's a lot of expendability, shall we say, migrant workers, people who come in and out, who aren't unionized, and things like that. We see it in Texas here all the time. All the outdoor work that's being done here is by, you know, sort of migrant workers and people who have no kind of protections under the law. So what can be done? So what can be done is the same thing that is done in other dangerous workplace conditions, which is laws are passed that help to protect workers. I mean, OSHA has been working on a sort of heat standard for workers, and it's not only outdoor workers, also warehouse workers, factory workers, things like that. Has been working on a heat standard for, I don't know, more than 8 years, and still hasn't managed to pass it, which basically would say, okay, in temperatures, when the temperature gets above whatever, 90 degrees or something, 85 degrees, 82 degrees, where you mandate a break every X number of hours, mandate access to water, things like that, right? And those are the kinds of things that we have in other dangerous work conditions. There's only so much time you can spend in these dangerous in these dangerous conditions, and you have to have breaks, and worker protections, hard hats, gloves. I mean, all those kinds of things are laws that are passed to protect workers from these dangers and threats. And that's just hasn't happened with heat at all, even though the feds have been working on it for a long time. In Texas here, or 2 summers ago, no, last summer, the governor signed legislation forbidding any county or city in Texas from passing a law requiring water and shade breaks for outdoor workers. So he not only had they not passed it, we passed a law saying you shall not pass a law that will allow this. So, you know, by far the thing that needs to happen are these laws and need to get passed. But, that's obviously not going to happen under the Trump administration. And, I think that we're going to see sort of just, it's pretty straightforward, more and more deaths, more and more people who the worker I wrote about, who basically was a migrant worker, came up from Guatemala, got this job at a nursery, wonderful guy trying to save money to buy a house back in Guatemala with his wife. He was working in these fields. He knew it was hot. He knew the risks. He talked to his wife the night before and his mother the night before about heat risks. And he said, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." Well, he wasn't fine. He was working, and he made the calculation, like many, many, many workers have to make, is if I ask for a break, if I ask for water, I'll get fired because they'll think of me as unproductive, and they don't want to deal with that. So I'm just going to keep on. And he kept on, and he ended up dead.
Thank you so much for answering my question. And this will take me to my last question. So, as an individual who's currently in college, I tend to be very consumed in my day-to-day routine and sometimes forget that climate change, global warming is a present-day issue. Uh, in class and in social media, we often hear, oh, cut back on water usage or turn off the electricity or try and find solutions to combat the climate change. Are there new perspectives or new suggestions you have for individuals who feel like they don't have a voice or have a platform or a place to contribute to some change?
Well, I mean, I think that this calculation has changed in the Trump era, right? So uh, all these small scale things that we're talking about, personal habits of, you know, riding your bike and walking instead of driving, you know, recycling when you can, changing what you eat, right? The kind of checklist of personal awareness I think most people on this call probably know all about. Those kinds of things are really important. But but at this point, all this that we're talking about right now is a political problem more than anything else. It's not a technological problem. It's not a science problem. It's a political problem. And so by far the most important thing that you can do, and not only the most helpful, but I think also the most inspiring, to get is to be political about it. Join groups, lobby for, especially now, local legislation, local candidates who understand this stuff. We are not going to solve the climate crisis by recycling straws or by all those kinds of, or by flying less. All those kinds of things are important. We should all try to fly less. We should all, not use plastic straws. There's all those obvious things, but we need the sort of larger political levers to 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 deal with this. We need laws passed. We need, the big picture changes that are much bigger levers, not only on the reducing emissions side of things, but on the adaptation side of things, making sure most vulnerable populations have a voice, have protections. And that's the one aspect of this. Well, there's many aspects, but that is most difficult to grasp, and is going to be such a challenge in the next 4 years with Trump as president, and this obvious push for fossil fuels, obvious um, not caring about vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable, and it's going to be a war. I don't mean a literal gunshot war, but I mean a political war. And I think it's really important to fight that. And you, I think, joining political groups and finding like-minded people to work together on this is both important and also inspiring, because it's not a battle that you're doing alone or that I'm doing alone. It's something that we are all doing together.
Thank you so much for answering my questions. We'll share the focus back to Kathy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana. Thank you, Jeff. I would like to now introduce Jasmine Salazar, another member of our MIR community, to ask the next question or two. Jasmine is a third year environmental engineering student at the University of California. She's passionate about creating a cleaner climate and driven to make a positive environmental impact through her studies and hands on projects. Her interests include sustainable energy solutions, air quality, and hydrology, focusing on the intricate relationship between the ocean and environmental health. Thanks, Jasmine.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm kind of curious as to what gives you hope when it comes to fighting climate change and adapting to the extreme heat.
What gives me hope?
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, hope's a complicated word, but without getting all um, semantic on you here, what gives me hope is exactly what we're doing right now, is talking to you, talking to other people who care about this. I think that, you know, I get asked this question a lot in various forms. I've been writing about climate change for more than 20 years. And, the basic, you know, to kind of put it in a different way. The question I get is like, okay, you've been doing this 20 years. How come you're not, living in your basement, drinking bourbon, scrawling on the wall about the lost future for your children, kind of thing? I mean, how is it that you find any hope to keep going after, um, after thinking about this for so long? And I find it, I don't have that problem. I find thinking about this and talking about this and writing about this kind of incredibly inspiring. And, I mean, I have dark days, but it's mostly about, the difficulty of writing, the difficulty of kind of communicating. It's not about the kind of existential despair about climate change or anything, because I really do take a lot of energy and inspiration from people like you and from everyone on this call. I know it's serious. I'm constantly running into people who are doing amazing things, who are, whether it's scientists, thinking about kind of genetic changes for corn, or uh, political activists in a place like Texas who are, organizing in order to draw attention to the risks in vulnerable communities in Houston, or students who are asking me kind of really thoughtful questions about what's happening with the climate and what the future might look like. I just find the amount of creativity and energy that is out there in this world around this to be really inspiring. Architects, like some of the pictures I showed you of what's happening in Paris and even here in Austin. I mean, architects all the time who are building incredible buildings, who are saying, okay, we have to think entirely differently about this, about what Austin is going to look like, or what Paris is going to look like, or what Miami is going to look like. And I find all this incredibly inspiring and incredibly, like, I never feel like we're doomed. I don't. I feel like there's going to be tremendous loss and suffering as our world changes. And the world that my kids grow up in is going to be nothing like the world that I grew up in. But if we are smart about it and we don't give into despair, I really do think that in many ways it can be a better world. I mean, I drive down this highway here in Austin, and it's just strip mall after strip mall, giant SUVs and everything. It's like, okay, we can do a lot better. It's not like this is some kind of perfect paradise, that we can't think about how to re-engineer our world in a better way. And I think we can. And I think this is actually, in a terrible and tragic way, an opportunity to do that.
I completely agree with everything you just said. I want to thank you so much for caring and for giving many people a voice with your writing. I appreciate you for answering my question, and I'll pass it on to Kathy in case anyone in the audience has questions. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you, Jasmine. We do have questions from the audience. Thank you. I have a question from Herb, and he said that the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, HPAC, believes that restoring a safe climate by reducing temperature increases over the pre-industrial era to well below 1 degree Celsius is both essential and achievable in the coming decades through the climate triad: accelerated emissions reductions, large-scale atmospheric carbon removal, and most urgently, through directly cooling the climate through sunshine reflection, ecosystem restoration, and other safe and effective means. Would you support this goal and approach to addressing the climate crisis?
Well, I mean, kind of, my first answer would be a kind of course. I would love for all that to work and for that to happen. I think the idea of 1 degree of warming, I mean, we're already at 1.6. We're burning more and more fossil fuels every year. I mean, we may be hitting a tipping point on fossil fuels, but the CO2 levels in the atmosphere are continuing to grow. I mean, I do think that there needs to be a kind of real politic check on this idea, right? I think that um, we are. It's hard to see a scenario, for example, where we're going to see a rapid deacceleration of CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in the near future. Um, uh, Especially given the way that things are going now with Trump and everything. I mean, China and India are the big swings in potentially to change this, and they've made incredible progress, especially China in clean energy and everything. But the idea that we're going to hit a sudden kind of downturn, is I just think kind of not real. And I think that ecosystem restoration, all these other things are great. I just think it's a question of like, um, again, politics. How do you do this, and what is the sort of political levers you're going to pull in order to make this happen? And at one time, I thought it was going to be a kind of people's march kind of thing. That we had these big marches, 5 or 6 years ago, 10 years ago, in New York City and other places, and I thought there would be kind of people on the streets over climate. But that's sort of not what's happening. And as much as I support that and have written about it and participate in it, I don't see that happening right now. And so, I don't know what the kind of political Rubik's cube is to unlocking all of these kinds of things. So this is I guess, a long-winded way of saying I totally support all these ideas, but I think the question is, okay, like how, and like what's the lever that's going to make all this kind of thing happen that what we haven't tried already, right? That has not um, been part of the political equation so far.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Diana. Can you give an example of a country or town that has an adaptation and/or mitigation that has been successful at protecting a large number of its residents from global heating?
That's a good question. Um, that is, I think that there are a lot of cities that have ideas in progress and have done some things. Paris, I mentioned, I think is probably, if you want to think about it from a holistic urban point of view, probably done more than any other city. As I mentioned, there's the sort of greening of a lot of the public space within the city, the banning of internal combustion engines in large parts of the inner city, with something like the congestion pricing that we've seen in Manhattan. The cleaning up of the Seine to make it a kind of cooling place for people to jump into, which is, I think, really important. I also think it's really important the way they're repurposing sort of older apartment buildings and things and kind of gutting them and re-insulating them and setting up kind of cooling districts using underground geothermal cooling. There's been a lot of really inspiring stuff going on there from an urban point of view. And that's, again, we've been talking about politics, or I've been talking about politics, and that's because of the incredible political leadership of the mayor. She has been, the fiercest sort of mayor as a climate advocate probably in the world. And obviously Paris has money to do things, but the way they've done stuff, and they use the Olympics as a kind of tool to advance a lot of this stuff too. So when you think about it when I think about a city that's done the most, I would say Paris has done the best. Most hot cities are trying things, right? A lot of places are trying things. They're trying to plant more trees. Every city basically in a hot zone in America or in the world has tree planting programs, right? Tree planting is the simplest, kind of politically easy thing to do to try to cool off cities. We have cities that are experimenting. LA is experimenting with white roofs to change the albedo of the city. In some places, white pavements. Melbourne is doing a lot also in Australia, from planting trees to trying to kind of create what amount to what kind of wind tunnels that funnel the wind through the cities in certain ways to help cool things off, to things like pop-up cooling centers. So on days when you have extreme heat warnings, they have what would amount to kinds of air-conditioned tents that they put up in vulnerable neighborhoods to give people a place to go to cool off. And then there's things, some cities are experimenting with, naming heat waves and things. I talk about that in my book in order to give people more awareness of when a heat wave is coming. We do a really good job of that with hurricanes, for example. We have category 1, category 2, category 3. And everybody who lives in a hurricane area knows what to do. They know the evacuation routes. They know, the news is flooded with like warnings. We have nothing like that for heat waves. The media shows, you turn on TV during a heat wave in Texas and you're likely to see some kids playing in a sprinkler. There's no sense of the dangers and risks in that. So there are cities that are really working hard to do that, to change the sort of messaging around it. So there's a lot going on, but it's slow, and these changes are hard to fund. There's a lot of people who just like to do things the same old way they've always been doing it. There are a lot of forces against this. I mean, look what's happening in New York. Congestion pricing came in the first of the year. I was there a few days after. I could not believe how it had changed the city. It was more walkable, much less cars. It was just like way more pleasant in every way. And New Yorkers love it also. Paul Krugman, the economist, Nobel Prize winning economist who just left the Times and has a Substack, wrote about it yesterday or today. And I think it's 75% of New Yorkers think it's a big success, and it's caused the subway riders the number of people riding subways to go way up, and it's just been really great in all kinds of ways. But Trump doesn't like it, and some upstaters who never go to New York City don't like it either, in some theory of it being abstractly a tax that they don't even have to deal with. But anyway, Trump is going to, Krugman and other reporting has suggested Trump's going to try to roll this back just because he can, or he thinks he can. The question is whether he can or not. But so all these kinds of things are really hard, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you. Your mention of increasing albedo in cities as a strategy is a nice segue to this next question from Jonathan. He mentions that did you know that albedo loss over the recent decades has overtaken yearly greenhouse gas emissions as the most powerful heating mechanism? If this is demonstrated to be true to your satisfaction, will you help champion the activities to increase the Earth's albedo, such as reestablishing ice sheets and increasing land-based reflectivity?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I don't know what I can do other than write about it. I'm not, I don't have any magical powers. But changing albedo was really important. A lot of cities are thinking about doing it. It's what we talked about with white roofs and things. The question of, changing the sort of albedo of ice sheets is much more complicated and difficult. People have talked about putting kind of reflective covers over ice sheets to keep them from melting stuff. But ice sheets, of course, already have a pretty high albedo, so it's not exactly clear how that's going to work. I think the big albedo tool is solar and geoengineering. I mean, that's changing their albedo on a massive scale, and like I said in my earlier part of the talk, I do think it's something that's gaining more and more political salience because of the rising heat, because it's a techno fix that people love, and because it is a very powerful lever to change the Earth's albedo. So yeah, I think albedo modification is really important. I just think that doing it at a scale that really matters for the Earth's climate is going to be hard without resorting to solar and geoengineering.
Thank you. I want to go to a question from Eduardo. He said that his mother died of the consequences of a heat stroke in Mexico City last year. I measured the temperature inside her roof. It was 48 degrees Celsius. She was 95 years old when she died. I suggested to paint her roof white to reduce the amount of heat getting into her roof, but she refused and told me that she will never accept my interference in her life. How can we make people realize that there are some things that we can do to help prevent this type of tragedy, and that the cost of doing so is not it won't be just too high?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear for the loss, for your loss. That's very tragic. Whether a white roof would have changed the dynamics enough to, had a different outcome, I don't know. White roofs are important, but when you have temperatures of 48 C, that's really, really high. And this story illustrates also this question of, who's vulnerable. In the book, I call heat a kind of predatory force, that it kind of goes after the most vulnerable people first, and often they're elderly people who, because one of the first things that happens to your body when it starts to overheat is that your heart starts pumping faster and faster in order to get more blood out towards the surface of your skin where it can be cooled, and that puts a lot of strain on the heart. So a lot of mortality from heat is actually manifests itself in cardiac arrest or other cardio problems. But what we can do to convince people is that's the however many $1 trillion question or whatever. I mean that you would think that white roofs would be a pretty simple one, right? Because it's not hard. I mean, it doesn't require like complicated infrastructure. I mean, green roofs, which is the idea of having, plants and things on your roof, can also be effective cooling, but that requires a whole kind of changing of the structure of the house, because you have you have to put soil and things on your roof and water, and you have to change. The amount of weight is very different. I mean, they can work and they do work. And Singapore, for example, is a great example. That's another example of a city that's done a lot. And they have green roofs everywhere. I think they have laws requiring green roofs. And it's not a big deal if you design a building that way, but to retrofit is really difficult. But how you convince people to do that, I don't know. I mean, there's one great example of this is the house I live in here in Austin. Um, as in many places in Austin, our next door neighbor sold their house, and it was a sort of smallish house built in the 40s. The people who bought it, they immediately knocked it down and put up this giant McMansion. And it's a sort of nightmare looming over us, and it's a nightmare in all kinds of ways. But, you know, I know that they had done trying to do some energy efficient things, but they put a black roof on the house. And I was talking to my neighbor about this, and it's like, he didn't understand, first of all, the difference between white and black, but he also said, black roofs are cool. And he didn't mean cool as in temperature, he means that they look good. So there's this whole question of just simple aesthetics around this kind of thing that is a big issue. In Paris, also, there's a big problem, and I write about this in my book, with all these 18th century buildings that make up the center of Paris have tin roofs. And they're fabulous. They last forever. They're beautiful, but they're also complete like heat sinks, and they make these buildings very dangerous because they absorb so much heat. But there's huge fights going on in Paris about this because the historical preservationists say, no, you can't change them. You can't put on a different kind of roof because these tin roofs are what make Paris Paris, and they're iconic, and we don't want any kind of changes. So even though there are options that would make the buildings much cooler and safer for the residents, there's a huge, contingent of people who say no, 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 simply for sort of historic preservation purposes. So all these questions and all these debates about how do we get people to do things other than pass laws, which is its own question about how do you get laws passed about these things, is very hard. And, that is to do with, we have to raise awareness. We have to make people understand the benefits. In many cases, you mentioned costs. The costs are generally not an issue. Uh, Certainly with white roofs, that's not what is kind of driving um, the slow adaptation of white roofs. It's more cultural and technological.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Peter. Nearly 500,000 people die from heat-related causes each year, with the majority in the global south, home to communities with some of the lowest carbon footprints. Despite contributing the least to climate change, they face its most severe consequences. MEER is working to provide passive cooling solutions to those living on less than $2 a day, as air conditioning is too expensive and energy intensive. Given this disparity, what is your perspective on climate justice and the allocation of adaptation funds to support resilience in the global south?
Yikes. That's a big question. Well, I mean, this is the heart of this is the central dynamic of the climate crisis, right? Is that the people who are most vulnerable to all of the effects of impacts of climate change, from heat to sea level rise to disease changes to everything, are the people who did the least to cause it, right? And this is the essential tension um, in all of the international climate talks, right? At the COPs, everything. It's about, what do the sort of rich nations or the rich people of the world who caused this problem owe to the people who are suffering from it and did the least or nothing to cause it, right? And you could look at that from a nation point of view, because CO2 is, as I mentioned earlier when we started this talk, accumulates in the atmosphere. So when you look at it over an accumulated time, it's, the United States and Europe who have been by far the biggest contributors to the warmth and the changes that we see now. And, we've also profited from it. Industrial revolution, all the, industrialization of the 20th century that was fossil fuel dependent. And, the global South got none of those benefits, and they're suffering all of the problems. And so this goes to the questions about the Green Climate Fund. There's a mechanism that has been set up by the UN to try to shift flows of money towards the global South. It goes to the whole loss and damages conversation that has been going on forever, about trying to funnel money and technological innovation and expertise towards the global South. But it's a really difficult question, because just look at America. Look at the United States. Like, there's, the Republicans right now, and not just Republicans, but mostly Republicans, even just keeping money going to Ukraine, which is here and now, very present kind of thing that is easy for many people to grasp. Keeping money going overseas to support the war there is very, very difficult and may not last much longer. The idea of the U.S. sending money to Bangladesh to help people there, I mean, that's just politically not going to go anywhere in Congress right now, right? And that's been the case for a long time. So how do you change that? How do you get Americans to say, oh yeah, we are we did cause this problem, and we kind of maybe do owe, people in the global South, whoever it may be, we do owe it to them to help. I don't know in what kind of political formula that's going to work in the United States, anytime soon. And this gives rise to something I'm very interested in right now, which is you're starting to see a lot of litigation, right? You're starting to see places like a couple of the most prominent are Multnomah County in Oregon, where there was a big heat wave. In fact, the heat wave that I wrote about in my book in 2021 that killed 800 people. They have sued, ExxonMobil and the other big oil majors for damages related to that heat wave, and for the costs of adapting Multnomah County, basically Portland, to climate change. City of Honolulu and Maui are suing the big oil companies for the same thing. The roads are washing out. Waikiki Beach has to be re-nourished all the time. Disease changes, biodiversity collapse, big Maui fires. They're saying, hey, this, and then they're looking at the years and years of deception by the oil companies, where they knew about the consequences of burning fossil fuels and either lied about it or deliberately spread disinformation. And basically saying, you guys were big tobacco and you knew this, and now we're suffering and you got to pay us. And so I think that, I don't know if these suits are going to work. I don't know, but there's a big, I think there's 2,000 of these lawsuits globally now. This is where this conversation is going. And I do think it's the sort of fault line in climate politics right now is exactly the one that you've identified here.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. I know we need to let you go. I apologize to all of you who wrote questions in that we didn't address. Hopefully it was addressed to some level in other people's questions. I want to just leave you with, Jeff, with one, not to really comment on, but just this. It's more of an appeal from Mark. He mentions that you mention the solar radiation management strategies and showed us the typical strategies that the mainstream discusses when it comes to fast cooling methods like stratosphere aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, cirrus cloud thinning, and the always good for the laugh space mirrors. While there are problems with the strategies you mentioned, the realistic chances of emissions reduction saving us are very small. Nearly a dozen fast cooling methods have been proposed, yet we only hear of a few in the mainstream media, such as surface-based mirrors, which is the heart of MEER. These strategies were developed because simple emissions reduction is far too slow to save us. And luckily, more and more serious organizations and climate scientists are recognizing this. And so it just maybe a hope that you consider this topic to exploring this subject in maybe some of your future writings, just looking at some of the other surface cooling technologies and solar radiation management strategies that are out there. Thank you. So I'll leave it there unless you want to throw a quick comment in, but I can just leave it as a.
No, I mean, I'll say, I mean, I think all these ideas are great, and I think changing surface albedo in whatever way we can is certainly very helpful. I just think that it's one tool among many, and I think that we need to explore all of these things. I think that albedo management is really an important part of the sort of solution going forward. What exact form that takes, I don't know, whether it's from, people have understood that for a long time. You go to Mexico or Greece, all the buildings are white, right? They understood albedo, modification or the importance of that. I go for a walk in Texas on a hot day. Last summer I went for a walk and I realized I was really hot, like a block from house. I'm like, why? I was wearing a black t-shirt. I came home and put on a white t-shirt. It was a much better walk. I mean, it's really an important idea and a really important technology. It's just a question of, how it gets deployed, how it gets played out, what the costs are. But I think that advancing the understanding of albedo and the importance of that as a tool in the kind of quest to cool the planet is really important. And I'm totally behind that.
Thank you so much for coming to MEERTALK today, Jeff, and for furthering our climate education. And I love that you find hope in communities like ours and this talk today, and coming together to talk about and share solutions. And so we really appreciate that you joined us, and we really appreciate your books and how they do raise awareness for everybody. And I do want to once more highlight Jeff Goodell's book, the topic of today's MEERTALK, The Heat Will Kill You First. And it's just been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. And thanks to everyone for the questions and for being part of this conversation.
At MEER, we are working to help educate the public while also developing a solution to the warming on the planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website. We are primarily a volunteer staff, so please consider making a monthly donation of any amount if you have enjoyed being here or watching our MEER Talks on our YouTube channel. Also, please check us out on social media. And if you found being here beneficial today, please tell someone else about MEERTALK. We hope to see you all again for our March 2nd MEERTALK, when climate scientist Jim Massa will be our guest speaker. Until then, take good care, and thank you so much for coming.